Hello, Euro nerds, and welcome to yet another presentation in this wonderful course called AP European History. This presentation will actually be broken up into two different parts because it is a fairly lengthy set of notes. Uh, this presentation called Stuart England in the 17th century I have found to be fairly confusing for students. There is a lot of people, moving parts, civil war, additional revolution. It can get confusing. So this first part is going to cover the beginning of the Stuart dynasty and go right into the Civil War, and then ends once Oliver Cromwell kicks the bucket. So this is one of those topics also because it's confusing. The College Board happens to ask a lot of questions about it. Besides multiple choice questions, they've actually had two different DBQs related to the English Civil War and also the impact of the Glorious Revolution later on. It's one of these topics that the College Board just loves, so make sure you understand it. Here we go. So before I even get into my presentation, I'm actually going to take a trip to Google Maps and try and alleviate one of my pet peeves as a teacher of social studies is students do not understand the political and geographic makeup of the United Kingdom, also known as the UK. So please keep in mind this is the modern day version of the UK. This is not the 16th or 17th century version of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, blah, blah, blah. This is the 2022 version of it as I'm recording this. The reason I say 2022 is because Scotland may become independent at some point in time. So anyways, if someone says the United Kingdom, this is the country that it is made up of. It is modern day England, which is like the southern part here, okay? Then it also includes Wales, the western part. Remember Western Wales, here we go. And we got, and I should say, there's two more. Get to the northern part, Scotland. And Scotland is fairly large in its geographic size, at least for British standards here. But it also includes the Orkney Islands up here, the Shetland Islands all the way up here. So if you're a horse person, yes, this is where the Shetland ponies exist. They are very cute and adorable. Please Google them right now, Shetland pony. And then lastly, and this is the confusing one, is Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland is, yes, on a different island, but it is part of the United Kingdom. So Northern Ireland is not part of the Republic of Ireland, which is a totally separate country. So Northern Ireland's capital is Londonderry, also known as Derry, especially if you are a Catholic person from Northern Ireland. You'll call it Derry, not Londonderry. And remember, UK, if they say UK, it includes, again, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Okay, now I need to further complicate it. If you hear the words Great Britain, that is referring to basically this part here. So that would be England, Wales, and Scotland. So if someone says they're British, they're either from England, Wales, or Scotland. They usually, you won't hear like British if they're referring to the Northern Ireland area. Usually people from Northern Ireland will say they are Irish, but from Northern Ireland and make that delineation. Some do say British, especially the Protestants who live in Northern Ireland. They actually will identify as British in some cases, but overall they will generally say Irish. But if you do hear the word Irish, then most likely that is where they're referring to people living in the Republic of Ireland, which is a completely separate sovereign country that used to be part of the United Kingdom until just after World War I, but officially it is an independent country to the very day. So if someone says they're going to Ireland, they probably mean they're going to the Republic of Ireland, like Dublin, which is its capital city. So get that straight so you don't sound like a dumb person if you ever talk to a British dude. All right, I digress. Okay, here we go in the actual presentation. Stuart England in the 17th century. Yes, the 1600s. So, first and foremost, our essential questions as always. Again, use those for review purposes, especially for a unit test or the AP exam. All right, so first thing, we have Queen Elizabeth. She was the last surviving member of the Tudor dynasty. She was never married. She died childless. So now England's monarch will have a different family that controls the monarchy. So the closest heirs to the Tudors were to the north of England in Scotland, the royal family that controlled the Scottish throne at this point. Remember, England and Scotland are totally separate countries before 1707. So the King of Scotland at that point, who was James VI of Scotland, now will inherit another title, King of England. So he is King James VI of Scotland and also King James I of England. And fun fact, James VI was actually the daughter of Mary, Queen of Scots. So I think even after Mary, Queen of Scots got her head chopped off by Elizabeth, under the orders of Elizabeth, I think she kind of got the final laugh on that one. All right, so overall, in the 17th century, Stuart England importance, how to generalize it. This slide basically is your generalization. So this entire 17th century can be summarized between a conflict between the Stuart kings and Parliament. Basically, one of them wants more power than the other. So under Elizabeth I, remember how Spielvogel talked about like a balanced polity between Parliament and the Tudor monarchs, although you can make a very strong argument that the monarch had more power than Parliament. But here, now with the new kings in England, Parliament is going to see perhaps an advantage to maybe take over the Stuart monarchs. And that's going to basically lead to a political and also religious conflict between the two groups that ultimately ends in a civil war. And that will actually eventually get to the second part of our presentation. All right, so we have our Stuart kings. What do they want? They still believe in absolutism. So the Stuarts, depending on which one we're talking about, could be overtly absolutist. So remember, the absolute monarchs tried to centralize as much power among themselves as humanly possible. Again, the best example of an absolute monarch would be King Louis XIV of France. Don't say they had complete power over their kingdom. That's not really ever true, but they would try and get significant power. So the Stuart kings attempted to be absolutist, and then they go one step further. They also legitimized their reign by using divine right, saying God allows them to be king, not men. That is an important distinction. When you say God is the only person you listen to, effectively laws don't apply to you. And we're going to see some Stuart kings who believe that the laws of men do not apply to them. Then, on the other hand, you look at Parliament. Remember, the English Parliament actually has two houses. There is the House of Commons, which is made up of commoners, people who don't have a title, and the House of Lords, which are people who do have titles, like your duke, your dukes, your marquises, your earls, etc., etc. Parliament, which has existed, by the way, since 1215 when the Magna Carta was written. And Magna Carta, if you hopefully remember from 9th grade, is the first document in English history that limits the power of the English monarch. Not completely limits it, but it did limit it to a certain extent. So Parliament, during this entire time period of the 17th century, is looking to limit and reduce the power of the Stuart kings and officially maybe create a constitutional monarchy. So absolute monarchy and constitutional monarchy are very different things. Constitutional monarchy effectively means limited monarchy. So in some cases, I've seen the College Board generalize this entire time period as like the fight for constitutionalism in England. They're basically referring to the fight for a limited monarch in England. All right, next. The Stuart kings, if they want to be absolutists, they need to have complete control over taxation. That's the key. And at this point in time, Parliament controls the power of the purse. So if you want to really become an absolutist, you need to be able to levy taxes on your own without Parliament telling you to or allowing you to do that. And of course, Parliament would love to keep its power of taxation because they know that's really their trump card against absolutists. Additionally, they would like to have more control over the military, and ultimately, we're going to see that happen in the English Civil War. Okay, so here's now where it gets confusing. The Stuart kings, depending on which one we're talking about, could be Protestant or Catholic. So the first Stuart kings, so James I and Charles I, were devout Protestants, okay? They will fully convert to Anglicanism. They're devout Protestants. But after the English Civil War, after Cromwell is dead, the next two Stuart kings Well, one of them will be a closet Catholic, Charles II, and then his brother, James II, is going to be an overt, open Catholic, and that's going to lead to eventually the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So just note the first two Stuarts, Anglican, second two Stuarts, one of them potentially being a closet Catholic, the other one definitely being Catholic, leading to the Glorious Revolution. All right, so Parliament is always going to be the seat of like Anglicanism. What version of Anglicanism or the Church of England is debated? It could be a Calvinist version or a more with more influences from the Pope, like the High Anglicans. But overall, it's going to be Protestant, no matter what. Parliament, Protestant. Parliament, Protestant. Okay. All right. Next. So this was actually a recent addition to the notes. Give this a read. It's going to talk about the Magna Carta from 1215. Yes, I know 1215 precedes AP Euro, but the Magna Carta is great context for the 17th century because effectively the Magna Carta being the first document that limits the power of the English king is going to be our context for, constitutionalism in the 17th century. So give this a read, and now let's keep going. Okay, so looking at the religious aspects of the conflict in England in the 17th century. So, like, this conflict is not just political, it is absolutely religious as well. So, let's start with the group that we have more familiarity with as of right now. So, remember how the influence of Calvinism has now made its way to the British Isles. So the English Calvinists we will call Puritans. They quite literally wanted to purify the Church of England, the Anglican Church, of any Catholic traditions, which means eliminate the the bishops and priests of the Church of England in favor of perhaps a more Presbyterian model, which is made up of like elders and ministers. So basically, we have the Puritans, who also, most famous members will be like Oliver Cromwell. They're really going to be the leaders of the House of Commons eventually, and ultimately leading to the English Civil War. So like Cromwell was a Puritan, and they're really going to be the like spearhead of the English Civil War later on. All right, the moderates. So think back to Queen Elizabeth I and her Elizabethan settlements, where she made a more moderate version of the Book of Common Prayer, so she could kind of assuage a lot of the religious tension of the time. There are plenty of moderate Anglicans still around, and they would love to maintain that balance of religion in the Church of England. Then you have some of the more, I don't know if conservative might be the right word in this case. I'll go with it anyways. There are still Anglicans who would like to keep a more like Catholic hierarchy, Catholic-esque hierarchy in the Church of England. Not necessarily purely Catholic, because if they're purely Catholic, then they have to listen to the Pope, but they want to maintain a lot of the elements of Catholicism, but still be separated from the Catholic Church officially. The Puritans will despise these people. All right, our first Stuart king. So the first thing I'm going to tell you to help memorize these Stuart monarchs in the 17th century at least. Are you ready for it? You're going to remember this for the rest of your life. Here it is. It goes James, Charles, Charles, James. James, Charles, Charles, James. James, Charles, Charles, James. So we will have James the First, then Charles the First. Then after Charles the First is overthrown, he gets his head chopped off. And after Oliver Cromwell's dead, they're going to bring back a Stuart, Charles II. And then after Charles II dies, his brother will take the throne as James II, and he'll eventually get overthrown during the Glorious Revolution. So there you go. James Charles, Charles James. That's how you can remember it. You're welcome. Okay, so James I, we know he is King of Scotland at this point in time. So he basically held two titles. He was King of Scotland and King of now England. And officially, England and Scotland were ruled separately. They both had their own separate parliaments. There's a Scottish parliament, there's the English parliament. That official combination will happen in 1707. So the actual first Queen of Great Britain was Queen Anne, 1707. All right, I digress. So next, James I overall is not going to be like his successor. He basically wants to maintain most elements of Elizabethan England, especially with regards to the religion. However, he was an overt divine rightist. He said, the laws of men do not apply to me. He attempted to rule by divine right. I have a quote in the next slide to show you that. So overall, under James I, we see that Parliament has not been called too often. So if Parliament has been called often, what does that say about that balance between Parliament's power and the monarch's power? So here's a quote from James I. Again, when I see James I, he's often used as like a quote in a document to show divine right, at least in the English monarchy. But we're not going to call him absolutist because he did not have absolute power. He still has to deal with Parliament. All right, you can give this a read for more religious tension in the Anglican Church. Let's continue on here. So some other contributions of King James I, probably his most important being the establishment of a committee to make a more authentic translation of the Bible into English. So this King James version of the Bible today is the most common version of the English Bible. And the other reason it's important, it also established like the kind of the foundation for the modern English language, along with what Shakespeare started with his works. So this Bible is key to know, get some questions right on Jeopardy probably. So beyond that, he wrote a bunch of books. He kind of thought he was smart, even though we're going to prove that he really wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. All right, that's another reading on the King James Bible. You can read that if you'd like, but let's continue on. All right. All right, next one. So, what's going to happen with the Anglican Church under James I is that he's going to alienate the Puritans in England by really doubling down on enforcing a more moderate version of Anglicanism. Again, remember, he was very pro Elizabethan settlements, and he wants to continue that during his reign, but that will make the Puritans in England not terribly happy. So when he starts appointing ministers, he was favoring those more moderate Anglicans. And in Parliament, there is a growing number of Puritans who are controlling the House of Commons. So right now we're kind of seeing that metaphorical boiling pot of water getting hotter and hotter. It's not going to boil over with James I, it's going to happen with his son. Additionally, just something to note is James I is the one responsible for the first successful permanent establishment in North America, Jamestown, 1607, which you'll thoroughly know next year when you take APUSH or U.S. history. So we start seeing the importance of English colonization in North America with King James I. Okay, now for one of my favorite events in history, the 1605, November 5th. Gunpowder plots. So James I, as you have noticed, has not been terribly kind towards the Puritans, and also if he's going to be very Anglican, he's also not a huge fan of Catholics. And Catholics, likewise, were not a huge fan of him. So some English Catholics in England would love to see a new king of England who is Catholic, and they're going to attempt to do that through means of violence on November 5th, 1605. So here we go, the Gunpowder Plot. So this group here are the conspirators, most famous one being Thomas Percy, Guy Fawkes, although he'll eventually change his name to Guido when he took a trip to Spain, changed his name to Guido, and became even more Catholic, unsurprisingly, and then Robert Catesby. So their goal is if they could assassinate King James I, they would install his daughter, who was brought up Catholic, as queen and reinstitute Catholicism in England. So they had to figure out, all right, where can we kill the king? Well, they knew the king was going to open up Parliament with a speech on the 5th of November, 1605, and this speech would have happened right in the Palace of Westminster in the House of Lords, where traditionally the monarch always does open up Parliament, and their goal was to kill him there. So their idea to do it was to blow up Parliament from underneath. So, but leading up to November 5th, they started buying barrels of kegs of gunpowder and started bringing them to the undercroft, kind of like the basement of the Palace of Westminster. And once they get to like November 4th, November 5th, they had over 100 kegs of gunpowder, more than enough to like blow up the room. And with the king and probably most of the House of Lords for that matter. So on the night of November 4th, November 5th, there was a tip off. While the king's bodyguard was tipped off that there was going to be an assassination plot on the king. So they started scouring London and they came to this undercroft right under Palace of Westminster and they found this guy right there, Guy Fawkes. Like, hey, what are you doing there, Guy? And he's like, well, first of all, my name actually is Guy. And second of all, I'm just here, doing some work for my master and just minding my own business. And they're like, okay, good enough for us. And they left. Great bodyguards. So they kept getting tips that like they were really going to blow up Parliament. They came back to the Undercroft and they found Guy Fawkes still there. And they're like, okay, seriously, what are you doing? So they actually searched the Undercroft this time and they found over 100 hidden barrels of gunpowder. So they arrest Guy Fawkes, they eventually arrest the other conspirators, and they are put on trial for treason. They are all found guilty, and this gunpowder plot was unsuccessful. The king will not be killed. So Guy Fawkes knows what the punishment of treason is, which was hang, drawn, and quartered. So hang, drawn, and quartered ain't fun. The hanging part of it is where they put a noose around your neck, and they hang you just to the point of unconsciousness, and then they stop. Then they drop you down. And then they'll usually like, parade you through the street, which is the drawn part. And once you get to the point of execution, they will take a really sharp and hot knife, disembowel you, also castrate you. And if they do it quick enough, they will actually take those entrails and remains of genitalia and actually burn it in front of the victim, who will actually then watch all that stuff be burned. And then they'll actually sever his head, and then they'll quarter his body 4 different parts and send him to different parts of the kingdom. So Guy Fawkes didn't want that to happen to him. So when he got to the scaffolding, they put the noose around his neck. They said, do you have any last words, Guy? Do you have any last words, Guy? And he got so angry that they were calling him Guy, not Guido, his preferred Spanish name. He's like, call me Guido, call me Guido. He then jumped off of the scaffolding, and the noose snapped his neck and killed him instantly, and saving himself from the gruesome remainder of the execution. So, to the very day, the English, now really it's more of a British holiday more than just English, celebrate the failed attempt at assassinating their king. And they do it as a celebration of their king is still alive, not that they were hoping the king would die. That's not what the British would do. So they call this Guy Fawkes Day. Sometimes they call it Bonfire Night. And it's kind of like the British equivalent of kind of like Halloween mixed with Independence Day, sort of. And basically what British school children will do is they will make little effigies, like dolls, of Guy Fawkes, the most famous of the conspirators. And they'll like go door to door in Britain, knock on the door, and the person will open up, and the little British child will say, "Penny for the guy," and you give them a little pence, and they just keep doing that, and they just kind of collect a little bit of cash, and they usually just donate the money afterwards. Then at the end of the night, they will take their effigy to whatever main town square they're living in, and they'll have this massive burning of these Guy Fawkes effigies, like you see right here. It's such a great holiday. And folks, guess what? We're going to celebrate it in AP Euro this year. Depending on when November 5th falls, it could be on a weekend, so we might celebrate it on a Friday or a Monday, but if it does fall on a weekday, we will celebrate it in class, and we will also take our yearly photo to commemorate the important event known as Guy Fawkes Day. So stay tuned to that. You'll hear me talk about it in class, and you will be making effigies, maybe for extra credit if I'm a kind person. All right, I digress. Let's go back to the presentation here. All right, so King James I, he dies, not by the assassination, as I clearly just said. And now we're going to really see the English Civil War starting to get ramped up here. All right, so the son of James I is Charles I, and this is the guy who eventually gets overthrown, gets beheaded. This is the one to know, Charles I. So, like his father, believed in divine right monarchy, and even more so than his father, will attempt to rule as an absolute monarch. He will attempt to rule England for as long as possible without calling Parliament together. Let's see how he can do it. All right, so here I have a timeline of the Charles I's rule through his point where Parliament did not meet, where Parliament's conflict intensified once they were called back together, and then the actual English Civil War, which lasted from 1642 to 49. Yes, there's a lot of events and moving parts. Yes, it's confusing. Sorry, it is what it is. Come on, computer. Okay. So, Charles is not a huge fan of Parliament. If you're an absolutist, you're not going to be a fan of any Parliament. So at this point, England is fighting some wars. So we know that England was not fully involved in the 30 Years' War, but Charles was funding Dutch Protestants to attack Spanish ships in the sea. So that is, it's costing money. And if you need money, you generally have to go to Parliament to do that. So overall, he wants to basically rule without Parliament. So Parliament, as they've been dissolved and then called back, they're getting pretty ticked off with the king, who's trying to rule without Parliament to the best of his ability. So Parliament issues this something called the Petition of Right. And it's basically a list of grievances, problems against the king, and the most important ones being they cannot be arrested without being told why. So if you have a safeguard against arbitrary arrest, when you're arrested, if you're told why. That's also in the United States Constitution today. Oh, wait, guess where we kind of copied it from. All right. Then they also wanted the guarantee that Parliament would have complete control over taxation. So initially, Charles I agreed to the Petition of Right, but very quickly he reneged on the deal and then dissolved Parliament. This time dissolved them for a very long time. This period is called the personal rule of Charles I, which Parliament did not meet. So this time period of personal rule is going to be largely about taxation. So Charles I needs money. Well, Parliament it exists, but it's not been called together, so he can't just ask Parliament to increase taxes because he doesn't want to do that. So he asks his ministers to figure out a way to raise money without Parliament. Like, ooh, hey, let's use this tax called the ship money tax. It's existed for centuries in England. Historically, it was used to fund the coastal defenses. But basically, Charles I used that and then also applied it to inland cities who don't have ships at all. But regardless, what he's doing, he's just increasing taxation, is the too long didn't read version of it. And what he's really doing is he's also alienating even more people. So if you're increasing taxes, you're going to make people angry. He did make a crap ton of money. He actually was able to create a balanced checkbook with the ship money tax alone. But overall, if he's raising taxes, not only is he going to alienate the Puritans, who already kind of hate him at this point, he's also going to start alienating the middle class. And we know the middle class are often the wealthy who are always vying for more political power, and that's just pretty dumb. So he then is now going to attack the Puritans more religiously speaking. So he appoints a new Archbishop of Canterbury. Historically, the actual person who controls the Anglican Church is the Archbishop of Canterbury, even though we know the monarch is really on paper as the head of the church. And what he starts doing is they start getting rid of the more Puritan members of the Anglican Church from the high-ranking positions of the clergy. So now the Puritans are even more ticked off by Charles I. So we're just seeing this boiling pot of water getting so stinking close to going over. So let's see what happens next. Got some readings on the ship tax. So now we have 1640. So we kind of just fast forward a bit in the timeline here. 1640, Scotland revolts against Charles I. Yes, I know Charles I was also King of Scotland at that point. But at this point, the Scots aren't a huge fan of their king, so they revolt against them. Wait, if you have to crush a revolt, you need an army. What do you need an army for? Or how do you fund an army? You need money. So now Charles really needs money to crush this revolt in Scotland, which, by the way, is just going to increase Scottish nationalism. Now he officially called Parliament back to hopefully finance this army. Oh, and by the way, at this point, a lot of the Puritans who are in the House of Commons, Parliament, which is one part of the English Parliament, they're actually pretty favorable towards the Scottish at this point. They're concerned right now. They don't care about what the Scottish are doing. They are concerned about the fact that Charles I attempted to rule as an absolute monarch. So once Parliament is called back together in 1640, this is where we're getting super close to the Civil War, which officially begins in 1642. Okay, so let's focus on the long parliament. Don't worry about the short parliament, too confusing. Long parliament is the one to note here. So note the group that controls the House of Commons, which version of parliament. So the Puritans are going to be a version of largely gentry. So in England, the members of the House of Commons came from a social class called the gentry, and the gentry were like above the level of middle class, but not officially a title of nobility, hence why they can be called commoners, quote unquote, even though they were really above the level of middle class, but just not enough to be a noble. So they are landed gentry, so they owned a ton of land in England, they are very wealthy, and they generally were Puritans. So their goal was to make this Church of England more Calvinist, more Presbyterian. We know that. That's no surprise to us. And this is really the key. This is going to basically be the straw that breaks the camel's back here. So this now Puritan-dominated Parliament issues to the king the 19 propositions, and it was their proposal for a limited constitutional monarchy. What do you think Charles I is going to do? Is he, as a wannabe absolutist, is going to accept that? No, of course not. He says no, so now both Charles raises an army for himself, and Parliament raises their own army. Yes, this is the beginning of the English Civil War. So here are our two sides to really make this as simplified as possible. The supporters of King Charles, they were called the Royalists. I suspect you know where that name comes from. And their nickname were the Cavaliers. Charles actually was not well liked in London, so he actually had to move his capital to Oxford, which is, it's only like half an hour away. Well, today by train, I suppose. A little bit longer back then. And then Parliament's army, they were nicknamed the Roundheads because of a funky haircut that they preferred to have. And this was dominated by Puritans, including their acting general, Oliver Cromwell, who you gotta know. Give him a star. You gotta know Cromwell. And also his new model army, which was a better trained, used more firearms, along with historical swords, but he was able to use them more effectively than the Royalists. So, the English Civil War, 1642, 1649, it's basically a little bit of on and off. Charles I is captured once, he escapes, he's then captured a second time. Don't get super confused by all those little moving parts. Just know Parliament won the English Civil War in 1649. Charles I is arrested a second time, and now he is going to be put on trial. Give that a read, but we'll keep going. All right. So this new parliament, they call it the Rump Parliament because it was really only the devout supporters, largely of Puritans. You didn't see really any moderate Anglicans in the Rump Parliament for the most part. They accused Charles of treason. He's found guilty. And this is one of the first examples of regicide in European history. Yes, regicide, the killing of a monarch. So basically, here is our takeaway. Here's your historical analysis. Parliament is officially saying kings are subject to the law of the country. Divine right has no place in English monarchy. Then, they go beyond that. They don't just kill the king, they abolish the monarchy altogether. So officially, England becomes a republic for a relatively short period of time. Remember, republic, one of the meanings of it is you do not have a monarch. And this is where you get the famous childhood nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Yes, it's referring to Charles's execution. Now we have the Commonwealth, really the only republic in English history. Sometimes you will see this time period called the interregnum. Officially, the English royal family today only call this the interregnum because they don't acknowledge the legitimacy of this Commonwealth, the Republic. This is kind of a weird little British royalty fact. So we have republic means representative government with no monarchy. But really what's going to happen is eventually Oliver Cromwell will turn this republic into effectively a military dictatorship when Parliament gives him the title Lord Protector. And to give you an idea about Cromwell's personality, the guy was so Puritan, like just so Puritan. Like when he had this portrait commissioned, look at what he told the artist to make sure he doesn't like gloss over any of his facial imperfections. It's like getting your senior photos taken and telling the photographer to make your acne look worse. Yeah, you probably wouldn't do that, but Cromwell did because he was so Puritan. All right, so this next part I'll go through fairly quickly. I want you to compare life in Cromwellian England to life in Calvin's Geneva, which we covered during the Reformation set of notes. And remember how Calvin's Geneva was very strict rules about social life? You can basically copy and paste it to Oliver Cromwell's England. They also had a moral code. They remember how the Calvinist Geneva, they kind of eliminated all forms of theater. They do the same thing in London. They take the famous Shakespeare Globe Theater and burn it to the ground. Yes, that's how Puritan they are. Public drunkenness outlawed. Folks, you tell the English they can't have pubs? Oh boy, yeah, not going to work out too well. All fun is banned. Remember when I called them no fun Nancy's? Yes, we can call them no fun Nancy's again. So Cromwell is descending, becoming more and more unpopular. He doesn't get overthrown. He's going to die of natural causes, but overall, his rule is growing more unpopular. This idea of a resolute, strict republic is not working too favorably. Next thing to note is Cromwell's impact on Ireland. So at this point, Ireland is controlled by England, and there was a rebellion in Ireland. Cromwell sends in the troops and just starts pillaging villages in Ireland, and to the point where this is really making the Irish despise the English even more than they ever have. This is often considering a turning point for Irish nationalism, actually, because this is how they generally view English government, as that they just don't like Ireland. And also really entrenches English control over the land in England. So the wealthier English landowners start buying up the land in Ireland, jacking up rent prices for Irish peasants in particular, and basically making life absolutely awful for them. I've actually seen historian analyses of England's treatment of Ireland as basically England's first major example of colonization and a really strong control over their colonial lands, and will eventually kind of be exported to British India in the 19th century, at least that style of control. All right, this next part, I haven't seen it come up too often on at least the AP exam, but it's kind of cool to know the development of some versions of what we'll eventually call democracy in England. So there are two groups that grew during the Commonwealth. They're called the Levelers and the Digglers. So like think of the Levelers as they want to level the political playing field or equalize the political playing field. And they basically had ideas for an early version of democracy in England. They wanted universal male suffrage, although there's arguments that they may have wanted actually universal suffrage, period, regardless of sex. They called for equality between men and women. They actually wanted a constitution for England. Fun fact, the only written constitution in English history was a really short-lived one during this Commonwealth time period, and eventually was just scrapped once Cromwell became effectively the military dictator. And England has officially never actually had a written constitution since. Then you have another group who's even more, I would say, liberal, I suppose, in this case, called the Diggers. They basically wanted to dig up the foundation of England and create egalitarianism. Folks, this is like, when you call for egalitarianism, you're calling for complete equality across the board. And effectively, maybe, if they're talking about collective cultivation of land, that means they're kind of co-owning it amongst the population. End of private property. Is this sort of an example of communism without using the word communism? Yeah, a little bit. I mean, if you look at the root word of communism, it is communal or communistic in this case. So we could argue it is a version of a super early version of communism without calling it perhaps communism, communalism perhaps. All right, moving on. So now we're going to see the fall of Cromwell and the fall of this relatively short-lived Commonwealth Republic. So we know that Cromwell is getting more and more unpopular. When he died of a urinary tract infection, his son officially was given the title of Lord Protector. It's kind of ironic that they outlawed hereditary monarchy and in favor of giving Cromwell's son basically a similar title, military dictator, Lord Protector. But Richard was just not like his dad. He really wasn't politically in tune. The army wasn't a huge fan of him. And now we start seeing all of these issues coming to the surface, and the Commonwealth collapsed. It's just not stable anymore. So Parliament reconvenes. They call back the Stuart dynasty. Yes, they are now bringing back the son of the guy they chopped the head off of. So Charles II, who was in exile in France, really living life, to say the least, comes back to England and is restored as King Charles II. And that's going to eventually be our second part of this presentation. So I'm going to stop right there, and we'll call it a day for part one. Oh, here's a little fun fact. They loved making death masks of people, so as soon as someone died, they would put clay, like a plaster clay, like on their face to show their like last expression as they died. Kind of bizarre. They call them death masks. All right, I will see you in part two. Thank you for listening.